Good evening, Papua New Guinea, and welcome to another episode of Business PNG. Now, last week, the Business PNG team was in Suva, Fiji for the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat's Finance and Economic Ministers meeting. Amidst rising geopolitical tensions, the main priority at said meeting was Pacific solidarity and keeping the Pacific Island sovereign state's best interests at heart. The importance of a united Pacific has been stressed by Pacific Islands Forum Secretary General Adeang Taylor as geopolitical tensions continue to weigh on the region. Using the term Blue Pacific, coined during the 2017 Forum Leaders meeting in Apia, Samoa, she said the Pacific Island nations are stewards of the Pacific Ocean and its resources, and our boundaries need to be secured.
One of the biggest challenge that we have as a Secretariat is our responsibility is to hold the collective together. So you've got 18 countries. 2 of those are French territories. Then you've got 2 big OECD countries, which is Australia and New Zealand. And the aspirations are not always in sync with each other. Doesn't matter if we're from big countries or small islands or from atolls. Everybody is surrounded by the Pacific Ocean. So what do we do to secure that identity for people, that this is not just a whole lot of water. This is about stewardship of a great massive ocean that has been entrusted to us. And if you look at our economic zones, and it's substantial.
Adeang's comments come at a time developed nations are vying for the affections of Pacific Island states. A local example played out during the recent APEC 2018 in Port Moresby, which saw a head-to-head between superpowers China and the United States. While in Port Moresby to attend the APEC summit, President of the People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping, demonstrated China's growing interest in investment in PNG by opening significant infrastructure such as the Chinese-built $12 million 6-lane road from Waigani to directly in front of the National Parliament House. What could be seen as a counter-reaction to the China-PNG relations, the US, Australia, Japan, and New Zealand agreed on a range of deals with the PNG government, the most significant of which was to support the development of PNG's electricity supply, a $1.7 billion deal which will bring electricity to 70% of the population by 2030. Geopolitical jockeying by development partners, old and new, has Dame Mag, an eminent Papua New Guinean with experience on the world stage, worried.
What I think about a lot, and what I'm most anxious about in the region, is the geopolitics in the region and what's happening with the influence of certain governments who are trying to focus on some countries, not other countries, influencing some countries, and not thinking, dividing the collective. And if the Pacific starts working against each other, it's like family. Nothing happens of any great worth or value if you're not working together. So what we're finding is that the emphasis on bilateralism and regionalism is not high on the agenda.
Dame Mag called for Pacific countries to maintain their unity. She said the challenge is tougher now with the different actors who are offering different bilateral packages within the region. She told journalists that holding the collective together is a big challenge. I'm Ian Jarari in Manila, and you're watching Business PNG. China's noticeably growing influence in the region in recent years, especially in substantial investments in infrastructure development, has been met with mixed feelings. Some welcome the visitors from the East and their investments, dubbing the move the China alternative, while many question their interests and motives in the region. This new trend has seen a reinvigoration of commitments and investments into the Pacific from its traditional partners and neighbours, Australia and New Zealand. Most recently, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison announced his government's decision to establish an Australian infrastructure financing facility for the Pacific. The move has been described as a counter-reaction to the China alternative and a way to remain relevant in the Pacific. Amidst geopolitical tensions, Pacific Island Forum leaders are embracing Pacific solidarity like never before. Opening this year's Forum Economic Ministers meeting, Nauru's Minister for Finance and Justice and FEMM 2019 Chair, David Adeang, remarked that forum leaders aim to keep their eyes firmly fixed on the goal of deepening Pacific regionalism and working to achieve a resilient, sustainable, and viable Blue Pacific. The Blue Pacific narrative is a term used to highlight the importance of the Pacific taking ownership of its future. While each sovereign state has its own identity, priorities, and challenges, they are all connected to the Pacific Ocean and share the same resources and identity as stewards of the Pacific Ocean.
Well, the geopolitics of the region is that it's a very crowded space right now. We're finding that many traditional powers that used to be here are coming back again, showing a greater interest in being involved in the Pacific region. We're also finding there are new and non-traditional powers showing greater interest. There is, of course, greater interest by China and Indonesia, and by some of the Nordic countries come with very interesting ideas around ocean issues, talking to us. But I think the areas that the Secretariat is concerned about is that there's a lot of discussion around the Indo-Pacific strategy, and the Pacific leaders are not party to that discussion. And I would hope that there would be space for particularly the troika of the forum to be able to be party to those discussions. A lot of discussions about how powers see us, but not about how the leadership of the region sees itself. Around the security issues, but for us in the region, the greatest security threat is climate impact, and what happens to the physical security of people, the human security, and the food security, and we've got to deal with that. One of the other issues that I think a lot about, and our colleagues at SPC are doing good work on, is on the maritime boundaries. The Pacific countries need to secure all the maritime boundaries and to also make sure that our baselines are secure as well. We are an ocean continent, and we have to start thinking as an ocean continent. And many of our leaders do think as an ocean continent. I think Papua New Guinea's role in that is very, very important. Yes, we have a greater land mass, but we are surrounded by the same ocean, and we need to protect it and protect ourselves. I was talking about the geopolitics and the influence of many powers now in the region, and everybody showing an interest. Everybody, including traditional partners and new partners, trying to take a slice of the action. The slice of the Pacific, because of the votes that we have at the United Nations. Secondly, also our resources in the Pacific. The territory and the maritime area that is controlled by Pacific nations. The issue here is how our countries navigate all this and navigate those relationships. And where there are the big powers talking about the Pacific and how they want to deal with the Pacific, it would be good manners, but also to bring our leaders into that dialogue. Our leadership of the Pacific live in the Pacific, and what happens in the Pacific and the destiny of the Pacific is also very much a part of the responsibility of the leaders of the Pacific. And there is a lot of conversation by the bigger powers as if people in the Pacific don't exist. That's the issue here. It is a concern.
Dr. Sandra Tart, a politics and international affairs expert from the University of the South Pacific in Fiji, concurs with this sentiment. While speaking to the media earlier last week, she advised that Pacific nations should always prioritize their interests.
Be very aware of what their agendas are, I think. And they're willing to push back on those. But yeah, I mean, that's an example of, APEC was an interesting meeting on lots of fronts. And the China and the other thing, that was always going to overshadow it.
She added that China is here to stay and will not be going away anytime soon, and therefore leaders have to find a way to work with China and the other partners.
Well, I think firstly, China is not going away. So China is going to grow even more powerful. It's going to be even more dominant in the global economy and in our region. So a way has to be, I suppose, found to work with China and to work with our other partners as well. And the best way is to be armed with the best, knowledge and information, and be able to also, I guess, don't get played, by some of these other actors in terms of, we do that. I know we do that, and yeah, I think we have to protect our integrity as states. Our leaders have to be, strong on that. But no, I think being very forthright about what is in our interest. I mean, it's always going to be about our interest. We don't want to buy into this thing about China's coming in and China's going to take over, and like in Vanuatu last year, China's funding this because China wants to turn that into a naval facility. As the foreign minister said in Vanuatu, we are only concerned about our development. We are only concerned about developing our infrastructure for our, people, and it's not about China or about naval facilities or anything else. That's not on the cards. We reaffirm our independence. I mean, Vanuatu is not aligned. It will not start to, build naval facilities on its territory. And I think, people have to respect that and not get caught up in these other narratives that are going on.
I'm Ian Jarari in Honolulu, and you're watching Business PNG.
Welcome back. China's growing influence in the region has caused many to question what the country's motives really are. In a press conference last week, the Chinese ambassador to Fiji set the record straight. While concerns grow over China's influence in the Pacific, Dr. Sandra Tart, politics and international affairs expert from the University of the South Pacific, says debt to China is not the biggest issue that Pacific Island nations should be concerned about. Last week, she told journalists from around the Pacific that claims that the Chinese government is using debt trap diplomacy in the region are unfounded. Debt trap diplomacy is a type of diplomacy based on debt carried out in the bilateral relations between countries. It involves one creditor country intentionally extending excessive credit to another debtor country with the alleged intention of extracting economic or political concessions from the debtor country when it becomes unable to honor its debt obligations. These are often asset-based lending with assets including infrastructure.
As you know, there's been a lot of hype about how China is using aid, loans, to create a situation of indebtedness, which can then be, if those debts are not then managed, can then be transferred into some form of, assets. And these include ports, wharves, airports, and so on. And they've used a few examples in a few countries to say this is what China's intentions are, right? So, this has been applied to the Pacific and saying, the Pacific has to be very careful of what China's doing about, trying to create debt and create leverage over countries. Now, the evidence is actually not there to support it. There's been a high concern about debt, but the debt that is really a problem is probably Papua New Guinea and Fiji, which have high levels of debt, but that is domestic debt held by their superannuation funds and to some extent multilateral banks. Vanuatu, Samoa have had some degree of debt. The only country that has any semblance of maybe debt problems with China is Tonga. But those loans that are seen to be the cause of this were not triggered by the Chinese government. These were Chinese firms back in the early 2000s, mid-2000s, that actually sought those projects and sought the loans to fund them. So this was not part of any Chinese government strategy. And one would argue that this issue has actually come back to bite Chinese government. It's a problem. They don't want to see this kind of thing escalating. So it's certainly not the case that, and Vanuatu has also got some debt with China, but there's no debt stress, and it's not the case that they are in a situation where they could become
Defending China's motives in the Pacific, Chinese ambassador to Fiji stated that China only wants to help with the development of the Pacific Island nations.
If people ask me what is the main ultimate goal of this Belt and Road Initiative, or etc., of China's foreign policy, we have made it extremely clear. One, that China will try to conduct a major country diplomacy, because with the development of China, we have to learn by ourselves and also learn from others how a country like China, for instance, even we can learn from the United States, part of the United States, things that we can learn, and how we should engage with other countries, particularly with our friends, and how we should shoulder our responsibility, because we are still a developing country. In essence, we are still a developing country. And the second most important objective of China's foreign policy is to build a community with a shared future for the mankind, because we want to promote global prosperity and the well-being for all the people, not only the Chinese.
He continued that the geopolitics surrounding the region is not an ideal situation, and it's not one that China intended. He argued that if other countries like the US, Japan, and Australia can aid countries in the region, why couldn't China do so as well?
We have every reason to engage with our Pacific partners, including the South Pacific countries. So we have engaging with the United States, across the Pacific, let alone the countries between us. So first of all, I think people need to bear in mind, China is a Pacific country. It's part of the Pacific community. So with that in mind, do you think there's any reason why China should explain to many countries that we are engaging with the South Pacific countries? Why Australia and New Zealand can engage with the South Pacific countries, why the United States can, while China cannot, while Japan can and China cannot, while India can, China cannot. So the question itself, I think, should not exist.
And that's all we have for this episode of Business PNG. For more information, or if you would simply like to view this episode again, visit EMTV online at the URL at the bottom of your screen. Or to simply join the conversation, like our page on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at the Twitter handle at Business PNG. Until next week, have a pleasant evening. I'm Leanne Jarari, and this was Business PNG.